specifically necessarily. What first got me interested in general was the old live-action Batman TV show with Adam West and Burt Ward, because I'm of the age that I was like 7 years old when that came on, and before then hadn't really even known what comics were. And then one night, I discovered older kids in the neighborhood sitting on the front stoop with comic books. And I said, oh, those guys who are on TV are in these things? And so that's what got me interested in the whole thing. And I think, like most kids, you cycle through phases of, oh, Batman's great. No, Superman's. No, it's Spider-Man, So I think you end up being something of the culmination of everything you were exposed to.
That's awesome. Do you remember your first experience creating or drawing or coming up with storylines? I'm sure you were probably pretty creative as a kid.
Yeah, well, even as a kid, I remember I'd start out by drawing single images. So here's Superman flying or Batman jumping off a building or something like that. But then I think even beyond that, one of the things that also goes along with it is this idea of once Batman is, say you draw Batman jumping off a building, why is Batman jumping off the building? Well, that means you've got a panel that goes before that, or the Joker is knocking him off the building or something, So I was starting to write and draw my own stories. Yeah.
That's amazing. And obviously, so it was funny, yesterday I had you sign Superman 75, and I'm sure you have a million other stories I want to hear, but that's one of the only comics from my childhood that I still have. And I'm sure you hear that so much. What was it like to be involved with entry points into comics or entry points into superheroes? It's such a huge art. We just talked about Man of Steel.
Right.
Such big events. What was that like?
Well, it was, as we were preparing the story, we had no idea it was going to become as big as it did. And so once it happened, we were constantly on the phone with each other saying, can you believe this? Or have you heard about that? Or did you see this thing on TV? So we were just kind of as surprised as anyone could be in riding the wave. And I think along with that, not knowing it would ever get that big, we couldn't imagine that 30 years later, because that was 1992, that we'd be here still talking about it, and that it would all stay in print, and that we'd still be signing these things. You couldn't imagine it. And you couldn't imagine that different interpretations of it would be done on live action and in animation, and in a number of different ways.
What was it like watching it when we talked about Man of Steel, and obviously we have Batman and Superman, seeing this creation come to life? I remember feeling, and obviously I've been involved in it, but when Bane, because around the same time, because they're breaking up Batman and such an era that's so, again, nostalgic. Seeing these things on screen, what was that feeling? Sitting in that theater and seeing that?
Well, it happens on a couple of different levels, and one is that characters you created are up there, and that's cool to see. It's like I did my first little initial design of Doomsday. It was like a 2-inch high squiggly drawing that I just kept refining, and then eventually he ends up on the big screen. But then in addition to that, when you do a scene in a comic like Lois holding Superman's body, and they replicate that on screen, it is amazing to see them actually do that and reinterpret what you drew in the first place, and that kind of validates your story and your choices in some ways.
That's awesome. And what's I know the big announcement came out this week. I actually saw the interview you did with DC.
Oh, okay.
I picked it up on LinkedIn of all places.
Oh, okay.
It was great. What is it like to bring? It seems a lot of the same creators are back together.
Right.
It must be just an absolute labor of love to kind of bring a different. Almost turning the prism a little bit. It's coming from the eyes of, I think it's John, right? And
yeah.
What is that like to bring that back 30 years later and work with some of the same
guys? First of all, it's always fun to get the band back together, if you will. So it's like for Brett Breeding and I, and Brett is inking me on the story, it's our first interior work together at DC in 25 years or so. And it's fun to see everyone's work coming in. Across the internet transom again, and to see, so here's Louise Simonson and John Bogdanoff, and here's Jerry Ordway and Tom Grummett and Roger Stern and Butch Keiss, because those were the teams of the day, and to also be able to put kind of a spin of today on the story, which is basically John he's at the age of 9, and he's in school one day, and someone appears and they're wearing a black armband with the Superman symbol on it. And he says, I'm here to talk to you about the most famous day in the history of Metropolis, the day Superman died. And John Kent can just say, what? Because he never heard the story. So by seeing it through his eyes, it's a way for us to explain to new readers kind of what it was all about.
It's so cool. It's like a meta way of like always new, readers and audiences coming in.
Right.
It's like they're enjoying it with it, which is super cool.
Yeah, and what I tell people is, if you were there 30 years ago, and you remember the lines around the stores and everything that was going on at that time, you're going to get some warm nostalgia out of this, right? I mean, you're going to like it because of that. If you are a new reader who wasn't there, I think we'll be able to show you a little bit of what things were sort of like at the time and the craziness of it all. So, yeah, the idea is for this to function on a couple different levels.
Does it feel different now? Like when you said that, like the visual, and when I was reading the interview, I thought of it too. Like I remember being at my store and waiting for it to come out and all these issues. And there's just such I guess this generation misses out on that like camaraderie and that essence of fandom. But though the conventions are pretty cool too, we get people together. So
yeah. Well, and at that time there was no internet to speak of, and I think that allowed us to surprise the market in a way that would be impossible to do today. And I think that was key to the success of our story, that people didn't know what was necessarily coming around the corner, and now that's virtually impossible to do. And at the same time, and this was the story everywhere, I was driving to a store to do a signing, cold, wet November night, cold, kind of icy rain, and I approached the store and there was a line outside the store, and I thought, well, what's going on? Like they couldn't get in or something. Like no one opened up. And then, went down around the corner and around the next block and down the street. And that's what we all experienced, and that's what every reader experienced, because it was like that everywhere.
That's awesome. And for you personally, coming full circle, like we said, obviously being a kid and getting through the Batman show and then seeing the comics, do you ever imagine that so many years later you have such an impact comics and different media platforms and be in a situation like this? What is like the biggest thrill for you? Because it's such a cool thing to have a stamp on such a huge impact, different storylines and characters and an entire genre. What's that? That's a big question, I know.
It is a big question, but I really think that the answer to that is the fact that here we are all this time later, and it's still something that's being talked about. Right? Because, now people are accustomed to the idea that you get, if you do a 3 or 4 part, 6-part story in the comic, that it's going to be collected and printed as a trade, and it'll be available digitally, and, maybe get interpreted into a medium somewhere, who knows. Back then, we did a story and that would be it, because things weren't necessarily collected. So that when we did the Death of Superman and they pulled it together as a collection right before Christmas, a trade paperback for people to have, that was rare. I mean, usually you got your story printed and then you just went on to the next thing and it'd be forgotten. And now that is much more common. And the idea that these stories endure, that is much more common than it was then. And for us to have one that has endured now for 3 decades, I think we all are very proud of that fact and take a lot of consolation in the idea that not was it just a big thing, but that it was also a really good story. Because what I always tell people is bad stories get forgotten, good stories live on.
And then my last question will be open-ended. I always like to end this way. What other projects are you working on that you're excited, or is there anything in the future that you want to get your hands on and tackle from a unique perspective?
Well, right now I'm just barely trying to get the Superman 30th anniversary special done. So for now, that's like as soon as I get home tomorrow morning, that's what I'm working on, because we're getting close to being up against it, and that has to get done.
What is your process like? I always like asking that too for greater people. Like, what is your process like?
So yeah, in this case, the story was written in. We turned that in like in April. And then, at the same time, I was winding down a couple of other projects, and so I really started drawing primarily at the end of May, because I'm doing a 41-page story for this, and we also did a massive, like, 3-panel fold-out cover, which took like a week and a half. So, you know, we've been working on it, but in terms of process, I write the story, then I draw it, and every time I have about 10 pages done, I go back in and script the pages so that they're done and can move on through lettering and production and everything else. So it's kind of like, you know, everything gets done in stages and steps. So we've got about a quarter of it left to go.
It's like a big piece of art going down the sections and figuring it out.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. So, you know, and the other thing is, I always say, the creative process is not linear. Everyone thinks you just start here and go there, and it isn't that. And it never is. And it's, you know, 2 steps forward, then you want to make a change, and back and up and down, and that's really that's the process of creativity. And that's why when the Beatles had their documentary that Peter Jackson did on, that was so fascinating is watching them, and I know some people were bored by it, but watching them go through the process of creation and building a song and everything. That's the best explanation, because it took the time to let it play out, of the creative process that I think you'll ever see.
Yeah, there was a Stones one too. It's Crossfire Hurricane. That was really interesting also, and I think it focuses on that album they did, but it's also really cool that it went through the creative process. I always get fascinated by that.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, and when you're watching someone on camera do an interview, and in the background you have McCartney just kind of poking at the piano, that's how it goes. And it's like if I do a drawing, it's a lot of sketching, and sometimes the figure's looking good, and then you spend a half hour on it and it sucks, and you throw it away and start over again. That's how things go.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Absolutely.